You may think that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest we ever came to total annihilation. However, in 1983, one spy may have single-handedly prevented nuclear Armageddon.
And now in the process, he became one nation's traitor and another nation's hero.
Oleg Gordievsky joined the KGB in the early 60s, quickly rising up the ranks.
He rose up through the ranks of the Soviet intelligence service at almost record speed. His father was a KGB officer. He was born into the KGB.
The gifted young agent was sent to the Soviet embassy in Copenhagen in 1966. At the time, the KGB had a huge intelligence presence in the city.
Between 30 and 40% of the employees at the Soviet embassy in Copenhagen would actually be intelligence officers.
The Danish kept a close eye on Soviet citizens in Copenhagen, and it wasn't long before they noticed Gordievsky.
And we rather quickly found good reasons to believe that he was KGB.
Gordievsky continued his work as a Soviet spy, but things soon began to change. In 1968, he was outraged by the Soviet Union's brutal crushing of the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. More importantly, though, while living in Denmark, Gordievsky had fallen in love with Western freedom.
He met a country that was completely different from what he had been told. It's a free country. People can do what they want.
Knowing he was likely being monitored by the Danish, he started to send covert signals indicating that he wanted to defect. After tapping Oleg's phone, the Danish Secret Service overheard him talking to his wife about the Soviet Union's crimes, and it became clear that Oleg represented a real opportunity for the West.
That was the day where we said, this man may be willing to switch sides and work with us.
The Danish asked the British for help, and in 1974, MI6 approached Gordievsky at a badminton hall in Copenhagen.
The rendezvous at the badminton hall was a huge gamble for everyone. The British couldn't be sure Gordievsky wasn't a double agent, positioned by the KGB to infiltrate them. And for his part, Gordievsky couldn't be sure that the meet wasn't a trap set by the KGB to test his loyalty.
But the risk paid off. MI6 successfully recruited Gordievsky as a double agent. Refusing any money for his work, Gordievsky agreed to sell Soviet secrets to the West.
He's doing this for ideological reasons. He's doing this because that's what his heart is telling him to do.
Oleg began to supply the British with the names of Soviet agents around Scandinavia. For 4 years, he risked his life to help MI6 identify agents across Europe.
He was risking death every single time he took a document out of the office. Every time he communicated with British intelligence meant that he was risking his life.
Oleg lost his value after being recalled back to Moscow for several years. Stuck in the Soviet Union, Gordievsky was no longer able to feed valuable information to the British. However, in a miraculous turn of events, Oleg was suddenly moved to London by the KGB.
He might well have been sent to anywhere. He might have gone to Sweden or to Germany, all sorts of things. But we just were lucky we got a bullseye there.
While in London, Gordievsky was able to pass the British hundreds of names and secrets.
I met my British contacts once a month. It was in Bayswater. A small flat was rented.
Throughout his time in London, Gordievsky worked with the British to ensure that he was also feeding the KGB information that they deemed to be valuable. They began to trust him more and more, as he rose up the ranks and gained access to more valuable secrets. Gordievsky gave MI6 the names of the KGB's contacts in London. The list included massive political figures such as trade union and opposition leaders.
The list of names he passed across to British intelligence clearly showed that the Russians were very, very interested in penetrating British establishment. And we know that a number of different British figures were involved in this, including someone like Michael Foot.
After being promoted once again in 1983, Gordievsky was MI6's greatest intelligence asset. His identity was kept so secret that not even the CIA or the Prime Minister were allowed to know. But Oleg's finest moment came when international tensions almost caused a nuclear catastrophe.
I knew it was a dramatic moment. I knew Moscow was nervous.
In 1983, the Soviet Union started to believe that the West was getting ready to launch a nuclear weapon.
President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were using very strong rhetoric against the Soviet Union that enhanced his paranoia.
In particular, Reagan's famous Evil Empire speech made the Soviet leadership extremely nervous.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
In reaction to inflammatory speeches by Reagan and Thatcher, the KGB ramped up their espionage efforts to see what they were planning.
One I always remember is counting how many lights were switched on in the Ministry of Defense after 10 p.m. at night. Now, there were a lot, and the reason there were a lot was not anything to do with nuclear war, it's because the cleaners were in, cleaning the offices.
During this time of heightened tension, the world almost ended when Ronald Reagan launched Able Archer 83, a military exercise designed to simulate the events of a nuclear launch targeting the USA.
They thought we were preparing for war.
So we were really teetering a bit on the brink at this stage.
In response, the Soviet Union placed hundreds of nuclear weapons on heightened alert. From the KGB's base in central London, Gordievsky witnessed the ramping up of tensions. In a desperate moment, he makes a move that may have prevented a nuclear disaster. With the Soviet leadership believing they were just days away from nuclear war, Gordievsky warns MI6 about the hysteria spreading through the KGB.
I spoke about everything which I experienced. You simply don't understand the mentality of the old Russian leaders. You're playing with fire.
Gordievsky's warning to MI6 was clear. If they didn't lower tensions soon, the Soviet Union could start a war. The Secret Service passed the information to Thatcher, who in turn took it to Ronald Reagan. Thatcher managed to convince him to tone down his speeches and cool down the situation.
She managed to persuade him, absolutely on the basis of Gordievsky's intelligence, that his speeches were simply inflaming tensions with the Russians.
In an unprecedented move, Oleg had single-handedly influenced the foreign policy of both the US and UK to successfully prevent nuclear war. But Oleg's finest moment didn't last. In 1985, disaster struck when he was called back to Moscow suddenly to receive a surprise promotion. Oleg was immediately suspicious that a Soviet spy had uncovered him. In fact, in an effort to find out the identity of the UK's most valuable agent, the CIA tasked their own spy to hunt them down. In a catastrophic turn of events for Gordievsky, the CIA agent who tracked him down was none other than Rick Ames.
What the CIA couldn't know is that Ames himself was a KGB spy.
One of the most infamous Soviet spies in history, American-born Rick Ames traded hundreds of names with the KGB for cash. His information led to the arrests of dozens of Western assets, including Gordievsky.
U.S.-Russian relations were chilled early in the year when the CIA announced one of its top agents was spying for the Soviet Union and then Russia.
Knowing that refusing the KGB was impossible, Gordievsky decided to return to Moscow and hope for the best. As expected, his visit to the KGB was not to receive a promotion.
He was taken by two KGB counter-espionage people, as he described them, big hulking brutes, and he was immediately on his guard.
Gordievsky was taken to a remote location outside Moscow and interrogated by the KGB. He was drugged with a kind of truth serum and asked questions throughout the night. However, Gordievsky kept his nerve and made it through without confessing. He was sent back to Moscow and put on house arrest.
There's also a lot of surveillance on him. There's surveillance cars outside his apartment.
Gordievsky knew that he had to escape the Soviet Union and initiated one of the most daring escape plans ever carried out by British intelligence, Operation Pimlico.
I went to the appointed place at exactly 7 o'clock.
While under tight surveillance, Gordievsky gave MI6 the signal to trigger the escape plan. He went to an agreed-upon street corner holding a British supermarket carrier bag. A few moments later, a man walked past him eating a chocolate bar. Using this secret coding system, Gordievsky and MI6 had agreed that the plan was on.
It meant I would be picked up on Saturday, the same week, at 2 o'clock.
That weekend, Gordievsky shook off his cover and took a train to St. Petersburg. From there, he made his way to the agreed-upon location not far from the Finnish border.
About 30 miles before the border, I was hiding in the woods at an appointed time, which was 2 o'clock.
Gordievsky waited in the woods, but had no idea if the British were going to meet him as planned, or if they'd been captured by the KGB.
He doesn't know whether the British car's going to make it. He's worried it's all gone wrong.
After some time, a car arrived to collect him. He was smuggled in the trunk and driven towards the Finnish border. Oleg knew that if he made it out of the USSR, he would be safe. But both he and the agents helping him would have been firmly on the KGB's radar. Miraculously, the car made it through 5 Soviet checkpoints without anyone checking the trunk of the car. Gordievsky had successfully fled the USSR.
A KGB colonel under house arrest and surveillance in Moscow, and then escaping back to the West. It never happened before.
After his escape, Gordievsky settled down in a secret location in the UK. For his treachery, he was sentenced to death by the USSR, and his location is top secret to this day.
He lives under complete tight security because he is still at risk. He is still under an execution order that was passed by the Russians.
Gordievsky's miraculous career and escape from the Soviet Union remains one of the most incredible stories of Cold War espionage. Not only was Gordievsky able to escape the clutches of the KGB and live to tell the tale, but he also risked his life to potentially prevent a nuclear catastrophe. Despite this, Gordievsky will always be looked down upon in Russia. To some, he's nothing more than a traitor.
Of course he is a traitor. The main motive of Gordy to become a British spy is vanity.
Thanks for watching History 101. Be sure to subscribe for more.